Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of Open Books with
Crazy.
Alana and Erin, two female leaders modernizing the accounting space. Today, we're going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, change and
Yes.
change management.
Yep.
We're going to explore how we as leaders handle that change management, how we handle change ourselves,
Yep.
and what we can learn from our own fear of change and apply it to other situations. We'll talk about remote change, hybrid, in-person change,
Yep.
all of those different ways that we experience it. But getting started, Alana,
Yes.
how do you handle change?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question. I think that's a big question to start off the episode. How do I handle change? I try to boil it down to the facts that I know are at hand, because I think change, while it's a pretty short word in spelling, can bring so much emotion with it. It's a loaded word, change, right? And what I've really started to do is I think you can get really hyped up over change very, very quickly. And sometimes I think it's a little fun to ride that change emotion a little bit. But yeah, I try to step back, boil it down to facts. And we'll dive into this in a little bit, but I really try to slow change down. And not so much, I don't mean that to say I protest change, because that's not it at all. I like change, truly. I think it brings more opportunities than it leaves behind. Also, I think it's just part of the world we live in. So if you're going to fight change every time, you're going to be exhausted. So when I say I try to slow change down, I mean I try to slow the tempo of it and just allow it to flow a little bit more organically, I would say, instead of letting it just be like a freight train.
Right.
Because I think change can get out of hand very quickly. So just trying to put a little order in the change, I would say, I think is probably how I handle it.
Great.
But definitely flexible, let change come.
Yeah.
Like I said, I welcome it most of the time, I think. How about you?
Similarly,
Yep.
change is something that I really enjoy.
Yeah.
I definitely ride that high of change too much. I think this kind of comes from our current ages.
Sure. Yeah.
I know I grew up in a really technically advanced family.
Yeah.
Both my parents were working in the computer sciences, so we had computers when I was small.
Yep.
And going from analog to digital and watching the world change. I remember my parents, or one of my parents, was working on Y2K stuff.
Oh wow.
And so I think from that I really embraced change, technological change, I should specify.
Yep.
When it comes to social change, more of management in the firm, or if things were changing. I remember when I first started at JCCS, when things would change at the firm that weren't technically involved, I was a little more hesitant.
Sure.
A little more scared. But when tech came to changing, I'm like, this is amazing. Let's do it.
Yep.
How can I do this? So, but as we talk through this episode, we'll give some examples of change that we've gone through with our teams and what we've learned from it. Because I've definitely learned a ton. But change for me has always been fun. I always look forward to it. And I now, when change happens, I'm thinking of a technical change, like the accounting software we use changed their reporting recently, and everyone's whining and complaining about it. And in my head, I'm like, I refuse to be the old person whining because I am one of the older people at the firm. And I'm like, I refuse to be that person that I saw 10 years ago when I first starting who was griping about change. So I purposefully will use whatever their like new thing is and be like, I'm going to be the first one to get used to this.
Totally.
So that they can't call me an old person who doesn't like change.
So a minute ago, you touched on being from like a family, you know, that adopted technology early. All that flashed through my brain was like when we used to have computer rooms in our house. Right? Like I my mind immediately went to the computer room that I had at my parents' house growing up. That's not a thing anymore, but that was like a blast from the past. So you definitely had a computer room. Right?
We did. Oh, yeah.
As did I growing up. Yeah.
The computer room. And then finally, like, we got old enough, my brother and I got old enough to have a computer in our
your
rooms.
Yes.
Whoa.
I know.
That was a big,
like,
finding the desk and everything.
Yes.
Oh, man. We could go on
we could.
This.
I had like a spinny chair. Oh, gosh. Yeah. Wow. Blast from the past.
Yes.
Anyways.
Computer rooms. But yes, change. Love it.
Yeah.
Probably a little bit too much at times.
Yeah.
So,
I get it.
In talking about changing with your teams, what have you found to be the biggest issues when it comes to change with your team?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the like biggest issues, right, if we use that word for the team, is probably just like in general what we see a lot with like when change comes to anyone. And I think a lot of it is like human nature instincts, just of like the fear of the unknown. I would say probably in other industries, but also in accounting, like we're pretty type A, you know, like to have things balanced to the penny, you know, like some of these stereotypes about accountants, like it's okay. Some of them do fit us. And so I think sometimes change can be scary for those personality types. I'm one of them, right? I like change. I like order. I do. And so change can feel very scary. So I see that in some of my team for sure. Just like that fear that comes up. You know, I think sometimes the questioning of like, are we changing just for change, right? Or like, what are we trying to achieve through the change? And I think that's a really fair question that gets brought up quite a bit. Also, I see sometimes that change can be like, it can pit people against each other.
Yes.
Like, because you mentioned, you know, those who adopt the change, the early adopters, and then those who are maybe against the change, I guess. Sometimes it can create a bit of a situation internally where you have like some team for it and then some team members, you know, still, it just creates a little bit of tension, I would say a little bit. So I see that rise to the top every now and again. And we'll dive into like how to manage that. But I think it's just, how do you lead through that in those moments that it bubbles to the top?
Yeah.
What do you see in your team?
Fear is the main one. The fear of I'm efficient at my job currently. How is this going to make me inefficient? Like, because you're ranked on efficiency or productivity. Like, people are looking at those numbers, and that you make a change to that kind of disrupts the equilibrium. Fear is the big one, but also just that friction. Change causes friction, and sometimes that's good. Sometimes the friction's needed, but it can create it between people, between the people and technology. Friction and fear are definitely the two that I see the most.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting too, you know, because we're both in public accounting, right? Sometimes I get the sentiment from people who aren't in accounting of like, you know, you're in accounting, like nothing ever changes, like it's the same, you know, and truly there is so much change in public accounting, especially in the accounting and advisory space. I think, you know, even in all departments in public accounting, like there's a lot of change, but accounting and advisory is driven so much by tech. And I mean, tech will never stop changing, right? So it's just so interesting. And I think it's important that we had an episode dedicated to change, coming from the accounting side, just because boy, oh boy, there's so much change within our industry.
I mean, just looking alone at the tax changes that have occurred within the last 6 years.
Oh, yeah.
Like, we had a whole overhaul back in
2018.
17, 18. W-4s changed. I mean, and then with the onset of AI coming out, machine learning is getting much more powerful. Like, what is that actually going to look like for us?
Yeah. Even down to during COVID, when literally the tax deadline kept changing. Like, that was wild.
Yeah.
So much.
And all the different programs that were coming out and how those were retroactively changing. And I remember doing webinars on those programs and being like, who knows if this is going to be the case in 2 weeks, because with the speed that they were changing these programs, it was an interesting time.
For sure. Yes. And I don't know, maybe that's why we're a little bit more comfortable with change, because there was like, for those few years, like, there was nothing consistent, right? Except for change itself. So yeah. So interesting.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So how do you mean the fear with your team? Right. That's what you see bubble to the top. So when you see that fear pop up, how do you help your team work through that? Because fear is such a tough thing to work through.
And it can be so all-consuming as well.
For sure.
For the team member who's feeling it. And I try to give the team members the space to feel that fear.
Yep.
And then kind of come back like, okay, let them get that fear out. Let them verbalize it so that we can get to the root of what is causing that fear. Is it the change, or is it the loss of productivity? Or is it that they're expected to now do 5 things instead of 3 things because now tech is taking over some of stuff, so they have to do this other stuff? What's the real root of that fear?
Yeah.
And usually you can get to that by kind of letting them just have the space to talk.
Yeah.
And asking some pointed questions to figure out what really they are scared about. And then it's answering those fears. Like, we understand that this tech is going to take time to learn. And it's not going to be perfect right out of the box, right?
Yeah.
It's going to take time for us as users to figure out the best and most efficient way to use the tech, if that's the change that we're implementing. How is it going to change your job? Like, we are aware that this is going to affect your productivity if that's what they're scared about. We know that it's going to take longer to do things until you figure it out. And we're here, we're all learning with you.
Yeah.
And I think that of kind of bringing them into the fold of, we're learning this just like you are. So we're all going to try to share what we've learned, kind of the best practices we're figuring out. We experienced this when we implemented a month-end close system. And by giving the staff the space to talk through their issues, we were able to come to a better understanding. They understood the why behind it.
Yeah.
They could kind of buy in. We had some of them actually do their own research and look at different products because we knew the problem that we wanted to solve. So we had them go do their own research and recommend a product that they thought would work well.
Yeah.
But I think it's mostly giving them the space to be afraid and then kind of bolstering them up like, hey, we're all there with you.
Yep.
It's not going to be a slick, easy thing. It never is.
No.
But that's definitely how kind of we have handled it.
Nice.
How about yourself?
Yeah, I would say similar to you, like myself also being vulnerable in the like, I'm also going through it as well. Like, here's what I'm feeling. So that connection and that vulnerability, I think, is important. But then I also try to, and you can't do this with all change, but try to identify like the goal of the change, or if it's maybe change that, has kind of been placed on us, identify like some benefits to the change, because I think reminding ourselves of that, like where we're trying to get to with the change, or how the change might benefit us, or the opportunity that lies ahead, I think that can sometimes help keep the focus. So we don't get so caught up in like the mess of change, I would say. So we recently went through some pretty large service changes within our accounting service line. And it was pretty drastic. And it kind of happened in a short matter of time, I would say. And it was scary for the team, right? And rightfully so. And so leaning on like what lies on the other side of change really seemed to be beneficial, to remind the team of like, this is what we're getting to, this is why we're not going through all this just for the sake of going through it. Like, we're trying to get to this better point ahead, and keeping that in mind, and just keeping that at the forefront of our brain, I think helped maybe balance the fear a little bit. It by no means took it away, but I think it just maybe put the fear into like a scale of like, okay, got to get through this to like get what lies ahead, essentially.
When you were going through that change or implementing that change, was that were you managing that change in person, or was it a hybrid, remote situation? How were you doing that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because I think that's like the other layer of change, is like physically or virtually where you're located. So I, while I'm in person with part of my team, the majority of my team is virtual, but I travel to those locations routinely. And so I'm definitely more hybrid than anything. And so in person, like I can, catch those like casual fear conversations, I guess I would say. And I'm able to like have those conversations in person, right? And really like read their body language, like make sure we're on the same page, or attempt to. Hybrid, it's a little bit more difficult, because what I see happen with hybrid a little bit is you have the virtual meeting, feels like things are okay, and then there might be conversations had that I'm not there. And then when I do show up, either one of two things happen. Either we push things under a rug and we like, oh, things are great, that's the messaging I get, or they've kind of already created the messaging in their head. And so now I kind of have to climb a mountain. And I see that sometimes I kind of have to restart that mountain from time to time, because I wasn't on site to help those conversations. And in thinking through that, the answer isn't for every location just to have someone on site. I don't think, because of the environment that we're in now, like that's just not feasible. So having more like casual conversations with like my virtual team has been really important. Allowing them like asking those open-ended questions of like, do you have concerns, or like what concerns do you have for me, or talk me through like an example. What I found is like having them talk through like, so if we go through a change in our service, and like having them walk through an actual like obstacle they're running into, and like working through that together, leaning on that benefit or that goal that's in mind. I think having those like hands-on moments are really important together, and that's hard to catch in a hybrid environment. So it's tough, and it feels like you're kind of fighting that until you both get on the same page. What I would say is I think change is also a cycle, and so sometimes you have to allow team members to like go through that journey, right? But still like supporting them, but like we all have our own change journey. And I think it's important to start to identify where your team is in some of those journeys, because I think that helps kind of outline the next step you need to take with them. Yeah. So you're virtual. What do you see in helping that change with your team in a virtual environment?
So it's very different. When I first started out in the accounting space, it was all physical. We were all in the same location. Each person or each location had their like tech person that would be in charge. And when I came on, that was kind of starting at the minimalist to change. But when I look back at that and how much it has changed to now, I have found that I need to know how people handle change at a much deeper level, because I can't walk down the hall and just happen to hear like murmurings and bubblings of conversations. So I need to know how each person, if I'm the one implementing this change with my team, I need to know how each person handles change in general.
Yeah.
Whereas before, I'd be like, I know that like this group of people not going to be the most forward. What was the early adopters?
Right.
So I know I'm going to have to work a bit more at that, because I can read their body language and I'll see them in person. So now I have to really concentrate when I talk about change with them, so that I can remember for next time we have change, like, this is how this person handled it.
Yeah.
This is how this person handled it. Because I'm not there, I don't see them, I don't get to hear the conversations that they may be having. They might be talking to other team members in Slack, like in a little chat. I don't see that anywhere.
Yep.
But I think also not just knowing that, but also creating a kind, going back to our servant leadership of creating that space for supporting that person in that change, giving them the space to be open about their concerns. I think having that there helps them become more comfortable with that change.
Totally.
And that is kind of no matter whether you're in person or remote or hybrid, but I think it is very important if you're in a remote aspect, or that's how the firm's set up, because you can't read everything, you don't hear the bubbles. But yeah, that's how it's changed. It's, I find, much more work intensive, and a lot more soft skill intensive, as opposed to like just knowing the technical knowledge of what's changing. But yeah, it's harder than I foresaw it being. Even with a very like forward thinking team as a whole.
Totally.
I mean, we still face that fear of change, the friction, and having that open space where they can talk is great. But much harder than I thought it was going to be.
Totally. And when you were talking, what's interesting too about hybrid is sometimes I find like my home location it gets further ahead with the change. And that's something I'm like actively trying to manage, because I don't want me not being on site full time somewhere, like to hold a firm, to hold a location back. But because unlike you, I'm not remote to everyone.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say it's like an unfair advantage by any means. But just making sure that like my effort with my remote team and remote locations is getting them the momentum they need that I feel like my home office gets.
Yeah.
And so that's something interesting. Like I really try to keep in check of like, my home office is like, has achieved this goal. What am I doing that's not allowing those other locations to meet this change goal?
Right. And
so it's something I've really had to evaluate, where, like maybe with a remote team, you have a goal and you're getting the whole remote team there. I feel like I almost have specific different teams.
You definitely do.
Which is just interesting.
And they're going to adapt to that change at different speeds.
Right.
Ooh, that's a whole other...
Yeah.
I think I'll take full remote over hybrid. I don't think I could do that.
It's interesting. To like, walk through the day-to-day of it. When you touched on like those different speeds of like early adopters, it led me to like my lesson learned from my team.
Oh yeah.
And what I've actually learned from my team, and I think not just my direct team, but like our full team of the firm, I think,
right.
That sometimes change, you have to you have to almost focus on the early adopters and work with the early adopters when it's such a huge change. And this doesn't, always need to be the case if you have smaller bite-sized change, right? But to really get momentum, it can be beneficial to like work with those early adopters and get them to become like champions of the change, get some wins, and then kind of roll it out to those people who are a little bit more hesitant or a little bit more where the fear has really taken them over, I guess is how I would say it. So get those wins is what I've learned to have a little bit more like case study for the others.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's funny. My thing that I've learned from my team is almost the opposite.
Okay.
But like, it kind of makes sense because I have a small team compared to your whole team, which is quite large.
Yeah.
It's interesting with one of my team members specifically. She's a little slower to adapt to change. I gave her the space to air her grievances, but like concerns and share why she liked what she was doing currently, what she was using currently. And she was using the system that we were changing away from very well. Okay. She had built it out exactly what she needed to do her job at the most efficient. And we were kind of taking that away from her a bit. But what I found is once I got her on board, kind of my laggard is the term that they use in that curve of whatever it is. She's not that far. Like I would still consider her at like the very end of early adopters. But once I got her on board, like it was pretty easy to get everyone else because they were already open to the idea of it. If I could get that person who is more resistant to it, like on board, then everyone else is going to be like, well, if this person can do it, I definitely can.
Yeah.
So I wonder. It would be super interesting. Next time we each have a change that we're going through, we're going to have to do like a case study.
Like a debrief on it.
To see exactly how it went. And we should try each way. Yeah. And then hopefully of course we'll have more change to deal with in the future. I totally want to test this out.
Yeah. To see
which way. And I'm sure it will depend on the makeup of the team.
Totally.
Like if you only have one early adopter and you have 15 people behind, like that one person isn't going to be able to champion everyone else.
Totally. And I think it also speaks to like the remote attribute as well. Like, how your team processes change really well. And I feel like I do with my team as well, but you knew like that individual, like they are still, while, maybe a little down the line of early adopter, they're still probably an early adopter compared to like the general, general user, I would say. Yes. And sometimes, that's not always the case. Like your team, you said can be made up of all different types, and you might have some pretty hard no's in your group. So I think like the method that you use is very dependent upon how the makeup of the whole team for sure.
It's funny, like I knew we were going to hit like this topic and like what we're all our recurring segments, of course, and everything, but talking about all of this change management just takes me back to the very first time we had to make a large technical change at the firm. And it was when I was at the large firm that you're at now. And we were changing from one old payroll processing software to the same company. It was just their next iteration. And I learned so much in that process.
I bet.
And it made me question why I was in this career or this industry. And this was 10 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you were with the firm yet. And at the time, we're all in person at 6 or 7 different locations, and we traveled around to each location.
Yeah.
And I wish I could go back and tell myself that like not all change looks like this.
Okay.
Because it was, as a first time dealing with any change management, I didn't know what the heck I was doing.
Yeah.
And I, being a person that likes change, was super stoked about it. Like, this is amazing. Look at what this new software can do.
Yep.
And the other offices were not super receptive to that. And unfortunately, the way that I handled that change management colored the rest of my career with those people.
Yeah.
That one, I didn't know how to listen to their fears, because to me, I was like, well, this system can do so much more.
Right.
Why would we not? And they're going to stop updating this old system.
Right.
So like, we don't really have a choice.
Right.
And I didn't realize how long lasting those effects were going to be.
Yeah.
A couple episodes ago, we talked about me wishing I could tell myself that not everyone needs to be a friend, because that's what taught me that, like, at the time before we started, I got along really well with everyone.
Yep.
They were all what I would consider friends, acquaintances, not antagonistic at all.
Yeah.
And then the way I went through this, even though I thought that I was doing well and I was doing everything that management told me to, and in the end, they hated me. And that stayed with that relationship with those individual people until they either left the firm or retired.
Yeah. And
I was never able to surmount that situation. So I would have told myself, like, hey, maybe temper your excitement, because this isn't exciting for everyone.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was... Talking about all of this brings up so many emotions. What would you tell yourself going through change?
Yeah, back then. I would tell myself, and I, kind of touched on this in the beginning, is like, change in and of itself, like, isn't good or bad. Mm-hmm. Like, change is, an event, like, it is what it is. I think how we frame it, how we message about it, how we create that perspective on it, like, is how we put that emotion on change. And so I by no means think like, I would tell myself like everything's rosy, and just communicate this way, because like you do have to be very honest about the change, good and bad, and what it's going to bring, as long as you like can define that. Mm-hmm. I think it's really important, but I would tell myself like, change isn't just naturally a bad thing. And change what I've learned now is like change can be very, like it can create new opportunities. Mm-hmm. And so I think I would just tell myself like, don't define it too quickly.
Right.
Like allow yourself to see what that end goal is first. And then kind of work backwards. And allow others to go through that change cycle. Without like defining it for them, I guess, with that emotion. So.
I love the way you had said that change is neither good nor bad.
Yeah.
It is a neutral thing. And my initial thing is like, change is always good. Where someone else's change is always bad. So remembering that can help us relate to our team more.
Yeah.
I'm going to steal that.
Yeah, totally.
Change is
Take
neither
it.
good nor bad.
It's not.
I mean, I think change is good.
but not like, everyone thinks that.
I know. But I think we're good. Thanks for joining us today with Open Books as we talk about change management. Probably could be another 2 to 3 part episode.
It could be our podcast.
I mean, really, probably could.
Changing books.
But we'll see. Yeah. Hey,
maybe
spin-off.
spin-off.
But hopefully we will have the opportunity to talk about this again and maybe have some case studies where we test it out, see what works with our teams.
Yeah.
We hope that by bringing forward the lessons we've learned along the way during our time in the accounting industry, that others can learn from us and share in our journey to evolve as leaders in the accounting community. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.